Hey, I'd like to welcome you all to the third task public consultation for the Office of Food for Peace's strategy update. Today we'll be focusing on conflict sensitivity. Oh, by the way, my name is Sheila Jackson. I'm the Senior Knowledge Management Specialist for the TAPS program. As some of you are aware, or those of you who have been to other of these consultations, the Office of Food for Peace has been seeking input from the PVO community throughout their strategy revision process. The TAPS consultations, bring together the Food for Peace and the PVO community to kind of share and discuss the issues that are most important to the food security and nutrition programming and how this knowledge can be incorporated into the updated strategy. So thank you once again all for coming, especially those of you in the room who stuck it out with all the metro problems. So we appreciate that. Just a couple of kind of house cleaning things. First of all, we will have a break today, and also we will be serving lunch. It'll be box lunch, so you'll grab your box lunch and then come back and continue to work. So it's a power lunch, so stick around for that. Also, we are broadcasting live online, so we know there's a lot of good things for people to say here, but please ask. We have 3 people who will be running around wireless microphones. Please wait until you get a microphone to say something so that way people online can get the full benefit of the discussion going on in the room. So we appreciate that. Okay, and also most importantly, while we are broadcasting out live, we are also recording this session, and we'll be making the meeting available by the end of the week up on the FSN Network website. We'll be sending out an email to let you all know. And also, we are taking notes, and those will be ready in a couple of weeks, and we'll also post those. So lots of ways to kind of revisit what was talked about here. Okay. So one thing I'm very happy, I'd like to introduce you today to our presenters. First, we have Joe Hewitt, USAID Conflict Management and Mitigation. Thank you, Joe. And from Factors, we have quite a few people, and I'm only going to say the Factors acronym once. So, Fragility and Conflict Technical and Research Services. And from there, we have as presenter Carlisle Levine, Nikki Goodard, and also helping out is Allison Poya-Clarkin and Elena Ponieva. Did I do that right? Yeah. Okay. And also, as always, Joan Whalen from USAID's Office of Food for Peace. So one thing I'd like us all to do right now very quickly is to do an icebreaker, get to know each other. So if you could please get up and find someone you don't know, introduce yourself, give yourself your name, your organization, and also ask each other, what is one thing that you would like to take away from today's consultation, or one thing you're hoping to learn? So if you could please get up and do that, appreciate it. Okay, please take your seats so we can get started. Appreciate that. Okay, wonderful. Thank you very much. Would anybody like to share what they would like to learn or take away from today? Anyone? There's no right or wrong answer to this, and you will not be scrutinized, I promise you. No one? Okay, well, this is just to get you warmed up. I know you'll be contributing a lot more as we go on. So thank you. I very much appreciate it. Right now, I'd like to call up Joan Whalen from the Office of Food for Peace to say a few words. Thank you.
Okay, I'll answer Sheila's question. Because it's one of the reasons that we called this meeting today. As many of you know, I see some repeat visitors that deserve a gold star because they've been to multiple of these strategy sessions, and we thank you for that. But there are a number of issues that we're looking at in terms of how we approach our work in the future, and reassessing the degree to which we want to address a lot of root causes of food insecurity. And so this is the third in a series, and it's looking at conflict-sensitive programming, which I know many of you in the room are aware that in our last strategy, produced about 10 years ago, in our results framework, it was recognized that conflict mitigation was extremely important, but it was a little dotted line off to the side and a little dotted line box, and it was a contributing factor. It was someone else's issue to deal with. And we're working in a different world today, and we also have a decade's worth of experience behind us to say it's not something that we can ignore to that degree. And so it is a really good time for us to take a fresh look at what is our role in terms of on that spectrum that we're going to talk about this morning, and what is it going to take to get us there to be able to do it well. And it's not a decision like so much of our work. It comes straight from the top, Adina Esposito, all the way down in Food for Peace. These are not decisions we want to make on our own, sitting inside the windowless Ronald Reagan building. But instead, be open to dialogue and be open to input, especially from the organizations that are out there dealing with the world we live in and the world we work in. So we're very fortunate because we've engaged in a partnership with the Office of Conflict Mitigation and Management, CMM, at USAID. And they're one of their new support projects, Factors, who are going to help us move forward on this path and determine the right way to move forward and how to instill better skills in our staff and better approaches in our programming. So I'm going to turn the floor over to them. They're the experts and they know what they're talking about. And we have a lot to learn from them, and they're going to help us find the right ways to learn a lot from you today as well. So thanks. I'd like to introduce Joe Hewitt.
I don't think I'll be getting into this. I think I'm just saying 2 or 3 things quickly.
Okay. Yeah.
Okay, great. Good morning. First off, I just want to say I'm so delighted to have this opportunity to join with you this morning and learn more about your work. Joan did a great job. I'm feeding back. Joan did a great job introducing what Factors is. Let me tell you just a little bit more about it to frame a little bit about what we'll be talking about throughout the course of the morning and the early afternoon. But first, let me introduce myself a little bit more. Again, my name's Joe Hewitt. I'm a senior conflict and peace building advisor in USAID's Office of Conflict Management and Mitigation. That office, we abbreviate it CMM, has a mission which I can describe in one sentence, but it'll be very broad. Our job is to support USAID so that the work we do in places that are fragile or conflict affected is more effective. And that means that our work can either work to address the causes or the causes of fragility or conflict, or be responsive to the consequences of conflict or fragility. That's a lot. There's a lot involved there. This particular project that we started late last year called Factors, it's a research service, and a big part of it is focused on, for the first year of the project, collaborating with Food for Peace to identify what kinds of very practical tools might be developed to help food assistance programs be more conflict sensitive. So we're not talking about long 40-page reports that go through a litany of considerations. We're talking about very accessible, usable, practical tools that help very busy Food for Peace officers at USAID, and then maybe implementers, do their work so that they're more effective in a conflict environment. So I'm thinking of things like, for example, a checklist of considerations to think about in a conflict-affected environment in an emergency context. Or maybe a panel of, or I should say a slate of different theories of change that might inform how a food assistance program might in some way positively affect conflict dynamics. Maybe a slate of sample indicators that could be tracked while you're monitoring the results of your food assistance program. These are just generic examples, but the goal for all of them is that they're very very practical, usable. They're things that you don't have to be a conflict specialist to be able to pick up and make an impact with. So that's the purpose of Factors. We're just starting out. And at this point, what's really important for us is to listen to implementers who are thinking about these issues already, to understand where they see the needs, where they see the opportunities, so that we can be a little bit more strategic about the kinds of things that we hope to design. So that's why I'm really delighted to be here with the Factors team. You'll hear a little bit more about Factors in a second, but I just want to say that I'm all ears this morning, and I'm really looking forward to the conversation. Thanks. Oh, I know, right? At the bottom? Oh, I blew the segue. Okay. I was wondering, everybody was looking at me like, you can't be finished. Okay, it's great to be here. I am, to start the conversation, I wanted to walk through a very, I'll call it skeletal typology of conflict environments. To start the conversation, I think it might be useful to point out that conflict doesn't just exist in one form. Conflict contexts vary, and that probably has implications for the way we might want to design our food assistance programming. Excuse me. And so I'm going to put this out as a point of departure for a conversation. I'm not putting this out as sort of the law of the land with respect to defining conflict contexts, but I put it out really more to be illustrative, and then to try to get you to think a little bit about what the implications of these different types of contexts would be for the work that you do. What kinds of work would be possible in these different contexts, and what kinds of work would be absolutely impossible in these different contexts? What kinds of considerations matter the most in one context versus the other? I'll fill in these typologies with sample countries, and that hopefully will get the conversation going. But what I'm especially interested in, and I'm only going to walk through this in about 5, maybe 10 minutes, is to hear your reactions about the big typologies, and then whether maybe there's some gradation between the countries in the same typologies and what it means for your work. So let me get started by going through a couple of definitions. This slide is a builder. I'll start off with these numbers, and then I'll tell you a little bit about how we got them. From the perspective of my office, we would say that there are 50 countries in the world that are conflict affected. And that 50 comes from 24 countries that we would say are currently in the midst of active conflict, and another 26 where conflict has recently terminated. We treat those 26 countries as conflict affected because even though active fighting is over, and there might be a ceasefire or even a formal peace agreement in place, conflict dynamics are still relevant. One of the reasons we know that is that conflicts that have terminated have a higher risk of recurring today than at any time since World War II. If you're familiar with the contents of the 2011 WDR, the World Development Report, which really got into fragility and conflict issues, it pointed out that almost all the active conflicts that we see going on today have recurrences of conflict that began in the last decade. So we really pay attention to places that are in this post-conflict phase because we treat them just as conflict affected as the places with active conflict. So this is what the world looks like in terms of the active conflict and the post-conflict. The post-conflict's in blue. All of these places have had conflict, active conflict end within the last 10 years. And then all the other places have one form or another of active conflict. So, and you can see we've got some different types here. We've got plain orange, which is, I don't want to call it a traditional civil war, but a straight internal conflict. There's nothing really traditional about war, and there's nothing normal about it, but I'll hesitate to use those adjectives. But that's what plain orange means. That's distinguished from red. Red is a civil war where there are external forces involved in the conflict. So that's a place where there's a civil war, but troops from a neighboring country or maybe a country far away have become involved, making it internationalized. that complicates conflict dynamics in other ways that we have to be mindful of. And then there are places like the DRC, India, Burma, where there are actual multiple conflicts going on. There are multiple parties involved in conflicts with the government over different sets of issues. That complicates conflict dynamics even more. So that's one way of getting a typology. And we'll keep that in the backs of our minds. But let me go into a little bit more detail about what we mean by active, post-conflict, and then a third category, conflict vulnerable. So starting with active conflict. This is a definition, and I'll give you a chance to kind of read over it, that we take from probably the world's best database on global conflict, which is at Uppsala University in Sweden. The Uppsala Conflict Data Program keeps data about all conflicts worldwide, updates it annually, and the data are very, very high quality. So we use that as our point of departure for all of our analyses on conflict. A conflict is, and I love this term because it sounds so academic-y, a contested incompatibility, that sounds very civil, doesn't it? That concerns a government on one side and an organized insurgency on the other, where the nature of the fight, the nature of the incompatibility is either control of the government or control of territory. That covers a lot of ground, so to speak. And it has to be the case, if it's going to be an active conflict, that the fighting has generated more than 25 battle-related fatalities in the last calendar year. That's an operational definition of conflict. And notice what it excludes. It excludes a situation like in Guatemala or El Salvador or Honduras, where there are a lot of fatalities that largely come from criminality, where there is a lot of violence, but it wouldn't count as an armed conflict the way we're describing it here. Those are violent contacts, there's a lot of fragility, but we wouldn't call that armed conflict. So we're really focusing specifically on the kind of thing that involves an insurgency, fighting the government. And there's no reason to necessarily limit it like that for our conversation here. Maybe it is important to talk about other kinds of conflict, but that's one way that we try to put sidelines on this definition in our office. So again, I'll remind you, I'm not trying to lay down the law of the land here, but I'm just trying to put a definition on the table to get us started. So that's active conflict, and again, you can take a look at the map. So now all those places in orange or red or in the orange and black, they're all active. They all involved active conflict. They all achieved that 25 battle-related fatality threshold last year. So I'll give you a chance just to stare at that. And then I'll go to post-conflict. So that's any country where an active conflict subsides, didn't get to the 25 battle death fatality within the past 10 years. That adds all those countries in blue. Okay? So all of these are very clean and neat definitions. They allow us to be very clear about the countries we say are conflict affected and which ones aren't. The next category is the one that gets much broader. And I know that we work in these countries just as much as we work in the active conflict and post-conflict settings. Those are the places that are conflict vulnerable. And so here, it's going to start getting a little less cut and dry. This is any country that exhibits any amount of fragility. Now notice I haven't really defined fragility yet, but I'm going to give you a definition in a second, or some risk of instability. In a range that could be from a very modest level to a very great level, and is not presently involved in an active conflict or in a post-conflict stage. So let me talk just very briefly about what fragility is as far as we're concerned. USA defines fragility as a characteristic of state-society relations. Sometimes the term is used as a synonym for state weakness. We don't really mean it that way. We're really focused on the relationship between states and their people. And we're interested in the extent to which that relationship produces outcomes that are legitimate or effective. Legitimate is, the extent to which governing institutions are accountable to the people, institutions are inclusive, they are focused on all major identity groups in that place. That's legitimacy. It can be national level governments, but also local level governments, which can be very important, I think, for a lot of the work that you do. Effectiveness is the other part of fragility. That refers to how well does society provide public goods to itself? Does society provide adequate health, education, economic well-being, security? A lot of societies can be good at that, the effectiveness part, and really bad at legitimacy, or vice versa. The point is that we find that any country that exhibits significant amounts of fragility is very, very likely to be conflict affected. Right now in the world, of the 50 countries worldwide that are conflict affected, 90% of them exhibit significant fragility in the way that we measure it. So I'm not going to go through the way we measure it and all that stuff. But my point is that fragility creates an enabling condition in countries that make conflict very, very likely. So in any place that exhibits a lot of fragility, but is not yet experiencing conflict, we call that place conflict vulnerable. So here's a list of countries that exhibit significant levels of fragility from a very low level to a very modest level all the way up to maybe a high level that are not currently in armed conflict. And we would call all of these conflict vulnerable. And you'll notice a lot of these are places where we do a lot of food for peace programming as well. So I would put on the table 3 broad categories of countries where there are really 3 types of conflict contexts: an active conflict context, a post-conflict setting, and a conflict vulnerable setting. And my suspicion, although I would really like to hear from you, is that each one of these contexts have different implications for what kinds of programming is most appropriate from a food assistance perspective, whether in the emergency category or the development assistance category. These one conflict context, in one conflict context, more things might be possible. There may be more opportunities in those kinds of places. In other contexts, there may be more limitations. Some things may be impossible to do or untenable. So I guess what I want to start is a conversation about what comes to mind first about whether or not these typologies make sense for the work you do. Second, I'm interested in whether or not you would like to make further gradations inside these broad types. I'll go back to a map because there's another way of talking about this. When you look at the active conflict countries, you've got places like Syria in this group, and you've also got places like the DRC or Ethiopia. They're all active conflict contexts, but they're very different in terms of what's happening on the ground in those places. So within the active conflict category, for example, you may wish to put more gradation inside that category because the gradation makes sense for the work that you do. So that's certainly allowable. And the same is true maybe for post-conflict settings. Maybe there's more gradation that you'd like to add because you know with the work that you do, one post-conflict setting is really not like another for some reason that I don't or we don't appreciate yet. So I want to leave it like that and open the floor up to your reactions to this typology, any changes you'd like to make to it, or any comments you'd like to make off the cuff right now about what's possible and what's not possible in these various contexts.
Hi, I'm Laura from the Student Care. And I just wanted to say, I think these are useful typologies, but that more gradations underneath them might be helpful. For example, I noticed in conflict vulnerable, I believe you had both the Ukraine and Kenya. And we know that there are active conflicts going on in part of Ukraine. And then in Kenya, I would call it perhaps beyond conflict vulnerable, that there are places within Kenya where conflict is going on. So rather than just active and conflict vulnerable, it seems as if within some countries there could be something of active in a certain part of the country, like active in the north. We know, for example, in Nigeria, where you might feel relatively safe now in southern Nigeria, in Abuja, you certainly wouldn't feel safe in northeastern Nigeria. Yes. So doing that sort of gradation within countries, I think could be very helpful.
It's a great comment. It's very true of Kenya. Kenya is affected by conflict. Al-Shabaab is active in the northern part of the country, and there's violence, and it's real. But it doesn't necessarily, the reason I think Kenya is not considered active conflict is that it's not really considered to be an organized insurgency against the Kenya government. I think that's the reason. Ukraine, I've got a much more sort of pedestrian reason why it's on this list right now. I'm going straight from the most recent data from the Uppsala Conflict Data Program. Ukraine's conflict began this year, or recently in 2014. So when we get the update, Ukraine will come off this list and be colored in orange. But I don't want to lose your point because I think it's very important. So much we see conflict localized, and capturing that, especially for the work that you do, seems very, very important. So I hope we'll continue that as we move along today, but I hope that remains a theme that we come back to. Other comments?
Hi. If I understood correctly, then with the definition that you're using from the Uppsala Center, one of the actors needs to be the state.
Correct.
So this goes back a few years to the example I'm thinking of in South Sudan, where initially in Jongle's state, the conflict did not involve the state. It was between the Murle and the Nuer, and hundreds of people, I don't remember the exact numbers, were killed, and any number of casualties. And of course, eventually, and this gets to the other point, if initially the conflicts might be over, let's say, natural resources, maybe public resources, access to public decision-making, public resources, they get instrumentalized by the state. And so while the state may not necessarily be involved with its security sector forces, there are literally hundreds or thousands of people who are affected, losing their lives even as a result. And just to think about that as you're looking at how you make your definitions and how you apply them.
It's a great point. One of the things this definition does leave out is intercommunal conflict. And the Murle and Nuer conflict in South Sudan is a great example of that. Doesn't involve a government. The communities are fighting each other. Those are real grievances. There's real violence that erupts. And it does have consequences for the programming that we're trying to do. So I'm glad you put that on the table. It's another type of conflict that matters for what we're talking about here. And certainly that conflict could exist because of competition over scarce resources. So all of that is very relevant and I think should be added to the considerations about how that affects your programming. Thank you.
Well, thanks a lot for this. It gets me thinking, which is, I think, the purpose of it. Yeah. All typologies have purpose and strengths and weaknesses. What I wonder about in this is if below this typology, which is essentially a sort of a dashboard warning light for whether conflict is hot, cooling, recovering, etc., there would be a number of shared characteristics or different characteristics in many of these countries around the causal dynamics and the conflict dynamics themselves. So in terms of field programming, the way that one would position activities in the field and enter strategically would be related to those specific characteristics. And if one were able to tease out some of the driving causes, root causes, if you will, and the accelerants of conflict, one might see different patterns grouping than those in this typology, which to use too simple an analogy, one might think of health risk factors, where someone had a risk for entering a disease or developing a fever, let's say, and then they were post-fever. but we wouldn't from that learn what the nature of the particular affliction was, ways to do prevention and treatment and recovery. So if we could develop typologies that were a bit more grounded in the conflict dynamics, I think we could tie our programming to them more effectively.
Yeah, I agree. I agree completely. And your observation is right. The typologies that I'm offering today are really not rooted at all in what's causing these conflicts. They're really just rooted in the status of the conflict. And in order to, you just said it very well, I'm sort of hesitant to try to repeat what you said, but an understanding of ultimately what is driving conflict in these places will inform better programming. I mean, that's sort of a mantra of my office. And we spend a lot of time encouraging the use of conflict assessments before, to inform our programming. Because once we know, just as you said, what the factors are that are encouraging conflict or maybe mitigating it, we can do a better job aligning our programs against that. And so that in turn will open up a sense of what kinds of tools might be useful for people who are designing programs that might be helpful to address those conflict dynamics. So you said it very well. I should probably stop muddling through anymore, but I appreciate that very much. Other comments?
I just want to come back to gradation of conflict. I suppose on the flip side of the earlier comment is, to look at countries that are within the active conflict that you have, and really to be cognizant of the fact that gradations within that also exist. You have areas of active conflict in the country, and I'm thinking Pakistan particularly at the moment, and you have vast areas where programming might be necessary but might be different depending on that context. So sort of gradations within that also.
Mm-hmm. Yep, that's right. That's a good point. And I think you will know much more about what those gradations look like. So maybe we'll have a chance to get into that a little more when we get into small groups a little bit later. Thanks. Sheila, I just want to do a time check because we started at quite a different time. How am I doing on time?
You're fine.
Okay.
You've got 9 minutes and 10 seconds.
Okay, excellent.
More than.
But I'd say something that may be relatively obvious, but just that, is this working? Yeah.
Yep.
Just that how we end up, rating any given country to the external world has quite an impact on the country and their economy and who goes there and even whether development workers are going, let alone, whether tourism dollars are going down. And Kenya is a perfect case in point where, the Peace Corps has pulled out. Many people are aware that Kenya has a lot of fragility, and so that's beginning to hurt the Kenyan economy. So that's just more of an underlining of the importance of our being very thoughtful as to how we categorize these countries and having different gradations and subgroups, because it ends up having quite an impact on the country's economy often.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. I mean, there's, I guess the word would be a stigma associated with designating countries as conflict vulnerable or fragile. The climate around this in the international policy community is changing. Countries are more and more willing to self-identify as fragile. In fact, there's a large international agreement now between self-identified fragile states and donors called the New Deal for Engagement in Fragile States, where in a sense there's sort of an honest acknowledgement that the places are vulnerable to armed conflict and that development needs to reflect that. There are 20 of these self-identified fragile states. Others that we might say are fragile are not part of that group. They tend to be middle-income countries. Kenya is not part of this group of self-identified fragile states. They're called the G7+. And you could Google it, Google the New Deal G7+, and you'll find out more information about this group of states and the New Deal. But your point is still, I think, an important one, because there is a stigma about calling countries fragile. It's a real thing. But it does, at the same time, I want to emphasize that it is possible to assess these dynamics in a way that's analytical, it's grounded in evidence. Countries can make improvements with respect to this, and there's no getting around it, that countries that do exhibit these features, they are much more likely to have armed conflict. And it's our responsibility as donors to recognize that, because we know what armed conflict does to our investments. It just rolls them back and erases them. So we have to be mindful of these things, but at the same time sensitive to what you're raising. So I appreciate that. Thanks.
Joe James of the Tax Program. I'll go, everyone's comments have just been wonderful, and I'd just like to express my appreciation for the typologies we're seeing is an excellent way to begin the discussion. And I'll go to the other side of the coin, the very practical PVO, humanitarian, we want to help and we want to work. That will be our worry about shades of categorization. Whether it's true or not, we have great beliefs that funding availability is inextricably linked with all this. So that's the opposite end of the coin of defining characteristics. And another reason we'd probably be really interested in gradations. We want to work in each of these countries and somewhere in these countries.
With Mercy Corps. My question, I guess, is: has there been a discussion in your office about one thing that strikes me in these typologies is violent context? For example, in South America and Latin America, and that Guatemala, El Salvador, Honduras, Mexico aren't on there, but the level of violence in those countries is extremely high, and it doesn't quite fit the state. The definition of what a conflict is a state actor, but the state lacking justice, of adequate justice systems, impunity is a big issue in that region. I'm thinking that Colombia right now does have a conflict, but what will happen, 10 years down the line if Colombia will be post-conflict, Guatemala is post-conflict, El Salvador is post-conflict, and those are countries that are experiencing some of the highest levels of violence. So just wondering how that categorization can be added to this conversation. They're not even listed in the conflict vulnerable list here, but definitely it's something that would impact food programs and whether or not that you can't even move to certain areas because of the crime and the gangs.
Right. I really appreciate that question, Leslie. In fact, we have been wondering about these connections, and we just started a case study project looking at how criminality increases or makes fragility worse. So we think there's something like a vicious circle here, where a place that exhibits a little bit of fragility opens up space for increased criminality, and then with increased criminality and the consequences of violence, you maybe get a degradation of perceptions of legitimacy in government. The inability to provide citizen security, or even the way governments respond to criminality, which can be perceived to be illegitimate themselves. And then does that in turn make the possibility of armed conflict greater? We want to try to understand those logical connections because we do think there is a connection there, and then figure out where the openings are to program within that. So the questions you raised are ones that we're thinking about right now. We're doing one of the case studies in Guatemala. The other one is in DRC. It'll probably be based around the extractives industry. And then we just finished the field work in Nigeria. So 3 very different contexts, but all focused on that connection. And I want to come back to the final point that even though those countries aren't on this list for conflict vulnerability, that does not mean that a lot of countries like the ones you're mentioning are not places we want to think carefully about the dynamics around violence and conflict and criminality for food assistance programming. Because I can see it's directly relevant, but those countries don't quite fit neatly into my neat little boxes that I'm presenting with you here. So I just got the 1 minute mark, so maybe we have time for one more quick one. I think.
I just want to make sure that mentioned before this conversation is over on the factors, and something that's very much on Super Peace's mind is you have these categorizations, but as we all know, countries move from one category to another. So what happens when you have a Food for Peace development program in northern Mali and things go down a deep climate? What happens when you have a Food for Peace development program in eastern DRC and all of a sudden you have an insurgency? And so to think about the dynamism of these conflicts and what it means about, what are the implications for your programs needing to be on your toes?
Good morning, I'm Ryan from the Hungry. This has maybe been said already, but what I'm struggling a little bit with conceptually is just the role of government in here. So I mean, maybe this is like a typology of fragility that we're sort of talking around and some of the drivers, but governments on all of these lists are either involved or not very involved at different levels. And, as a previous comment discussed, some are not very government related, but intercommunal conflicts. So just wondering if we can look at somehow level of public investment on its relation to conflict. I mean, and I just think of some of these areas that, a DRC that is, it's close to what you call a failed state in some ways as you can think of, where there's just not a lot of public infrastructure in some places that are very conflict prone or active, where active conflict is, and just how we look at that, kind of level of responsibility of government within these different areas.
Mm-hmm. I think that level of responsibility is really important. And that is why our definition of fragility focuses on a state-society relationship. It serves as, in a sense, the backbone against which all the forces that might drive conflict would be connected. When that backbone is healthy, when state-society relations are healthy, the state, to use your terms, is more invested in enabling the well-being of its citizens and empowering them as citizens. You're more likely to have a healthy, functional relationship, and the likelihood of conflict is less. I'm talking in broad brushstrokes, but if you can sort of trace that down to the context in which you work, where at some local level there are societal groups that are interacting probably with local governing institutions, how do food assistance programs nestle up alongside that to maybe improve that relationship? It might be something to think about that connects your work to the backbone that helps to fortify countries and make them less conflict vulnerable. So, Ryan, I agree with you. And these topics are all broad and abstract, but hopefully we can get that down to something more concrete.
Yeah, I just wanted to note, I was looking at this list, and I can see that there are about 5 countries on this list with developmental food aid programs active for Food for Peace. On the other list, with the active conflict and post-conflict, they're probably about the same number, if not more. Okay. Then, if you keep that in mind, there may be only 2 or 3 that are on neither list, as far as I can see, which really means that just about every place where we're doing developmental programming, not emergency programming, developmental programming, we are either dealing with a very fragile situation or one that has deteriorated in certain parts of the country. So we're programming in areas of certain countries where there is no conflict that's active, but there is still conflict active within the country. And thus, there may be a need to be integrating active conflict. First of all, we may need to keep in mind that conflict is always potential in all of these places, that we may be needing to address underlying causes of conflict and mitigating conflict in all of these places. So, you know, I think this is a really good focus for us because it's not something we necessarily take into account when we're planning on building resilience or building, addressing these issues in the context of a developmental program.
Great, thanks. It's a great observation, and I think that's actually a very nice way to close this session. That was a great discussion. I recognize it's just the beginning of the conversation. So I think with that, I'm going to turn it back to Sheila. Turn it back to Carlisle. Nicole? I'm bad on transition. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Nicole Goddard, and I am a member of the Factors team, and my other identity as the director or the associate director of the Do No Harm program at CDA Collaborative Learning Project. So I'm coming at this from a conflict sensitivity perspective. So since today, as Joe and Joan both said, is really for the Factors team about hearing about the experiences of the organizations in the room and how you're engaging with conflict, we wanted to start by, in this session, establishing briefly a very common frame of reference for the rest of our discussions for today, which is, you know, to sort of set what are we talking about. We're talking about conflict sensitivity. Where is it coming from, and how are we engaging in conflict context? So aid is never neutral. It will have an impact on the relationships between and among groups of people in the context where it is implemented. And it's going to have these impacts through the resources it brings and the means of transfer of those resources. So what it's doing and how it's doing it. This is a pattern that has been identified for over 20 years. Aid organizations began to identify this in the early 1990s as we saw conflict typologies globally change, but it could no longer be ignored following the Rwanda genocide in 1994. Following that event, several researchers began to examine what are those dynamics, what are the modalities by which aid has an impact on conflict. In the late 1990s, almost simultaneously, within 1 year, 3 different methodologies and methodological frameworks, conceptual tools for understanding the relationship between aid and conflict were released. And these are, actually, I don't know how well you can see, but on the far side we have the conflict impact assessment. In the middle, Do No Harm framework. And then on the side of the peace and conflict impact assessment. I'm not going to go into these tools. Various people use them. They're various, they're good for different types of things. They look at different elements of conflict. But essentially, all of them help practitioners to design and implement programs that will be implemented in context of conflict in order to take into account the conflict dynamics. So these are the 3 things that all of these programs do. All of these frameworks will do. They'll help help implementers understand the context in which they operate, the context of conflict. They help them understand how their programs and those conflicts interact. And then they help them to act upon that understanding in order to minimize the negative effects that their programs might be having and maximize potential positive effects. So conflict sensitivity, this is the backbone of conflict sensitivity. Each of the frameworks have a set of different steps and different ways of addressing it, different ways of doing the analysis. But this is essentially the goal of what conflict sensitivity is trying to achieve. It's not a project or program goal. It rather helps implementers to
achieve their goals without unintentionally undermining the achievement of that goal by contributing to the conflict that surrounds them. So this is the Do No Harm framework. As I said, I'm from the Do No Harm program, so this is where I'm comfortable. But what this framework does is I'm going to just talk a little bit about it. I'm not going to get into it too much. But it does help to achieve those three things that we laid out on the previous slide, these 3 steps, which also you have on a handout in front of you. So a dividers and connectors analysis, as you can see, the second column in on either side of the framework helps us to understand the elements of the conflict. What are the things that are dividing people, or how are people connecting despite the division, despite conflict that's happening? The understanding the impact or the interplay of the program in the conflict is that centerpiece. What are the elements of the program, and how are they transferring resources, and what messages are they sending that are going to have an impact on those dividers and connectors? And finally, the outermost columns, developing options, helps practitioners think about the practical steps they can take in order to act upon their understanding, in order to minimize dividers in the conflict or in the context and maximize and help to build on connectors. So as conflict sensitivity really got a lot of traction in the early 2000s, a lot of organizations, including a lot of organizations in this room, started to really adapt it and develop their own ways of thinking about how to operate in conflict situations. USAID developed in 2002 the conflict assessment framework. This was revised, I believe, in 2012. And so this is just an example of the type of resource that's available, the type of different processes that organizations take to look at their own interactions, but also help their partners think through these things.
Oh, we are meeting to decide.
So, as we've talked about conflict sensitivity, it has this basic goal of avoiding negative impacts and also building on positive impacts. We've seen that organizations tend to operate somewhere along this spectrum, where depending on, and sometimes it's depending on the kind of conflict context that they find themselves in, and sometimes it's depending on the goal of the particular program that they're implementing, they will intervene somewhere along the spectrum of avoiding the negative, so implementing a basic conflict sensitivity that looks at how can I not make things worse in this context, to building on positive effects, which would be how can I actually start to think about using my program, whatever program it may be, a food assistance program, a development program, a humanitarian program, to actually start to bring people together. And then finally, contributing to peace, and this is actually looking at how they can engage with those key drivers of conflict and actively work on them or work with them to help build peace and address the conflict dynamics directly. So before we move on, because we have a small activity planned, are there any questions or comments about what I've presented? And as I said, we're just really trying to establish a common understanding of conflict sensitivity and interaction with conflict. Huh? Okay. Okay. So what we'd like you to do is, as you came in today, you had a number of note cards, and you were asked to write write a program, a country and program, on those cards. We've put this spectrum, a little blank spectrum, up on the wall in the room. And for those of you who are joining us on the web, perhaps you can actually just write down where you think you might be intervening on the spectrum. We'd like you to take those cards and place them along the spectrum. And we realize that sometimes you may be somewhere in the middle. That's why it's a spectrum. It's not these aren't solid categories or columns. So feel free to use the space in between to sort of indicate where you think your program is intervening on the conflict spectrum. We've also added a fourth column to the far left that says no conflict response. Essentially, that the program itself isn't really engaging in the conflict, and we're not, there's no engagement with those dynamics. So if everyone can take, what, 5 minutes? 5 minutes? To just think a little bit about where each of those programs would fall on the spectrum, and then actually physically put your card up on the wall. And what we're going to do is we're going to come back to this in our small group discussions later. So you'll have an opportunity to really talk about why you put it there, and how that program is working, and to give a little bit more background. But for now, we're just we're gonna have it as a placeholder for our future conversation. Okay? All right.
Okay, so thank you for putting your programs up here on the spectrum. They will be the examples you'll be referring to in the small group exercise. You can refer to others if others come to mind. We'll also be referring to this later on. Perhaps over the course of your conversation, you'll realize that maybe you put your program one place and it belongs somewhere else. And that will be interesting, but thanks for putting those up there. It gives us a sense of where Food for Peace funded programs are currently operating, it looks like across the conflict response spectrum. So on the small group exercise on their tables, and if you're at either the front two tables, please join one of these two tables. Right? Are there spaces for everybody, I believe? And you have a series of 4 questions. And so the purpose of this time together at your small table is to talk about specific examples of your programming where, for example, you might be talking about Mercy Corps Uganda, you might be talking about CRS Burundi. What is it you're responding to? Why are you responding to it? How are you responding, and how is it working for you? So we want to get the sense of the case study, and we also want to draw out some broader lessons learned. And so closer to the end, we're going to ask you to put something on flip chart. So the starting point is you're talking about your Food for Peace funded programs, working in conflict contexts, and how you're addressing the conflict. And then what you're trying to achieve vis-a-vis the conflict, where it fits on this spectrum, and providing, again, specific examples. What have been your successes related to trying to do any of these things related to the conflict, and how those successes come about? And then what have been your obstacles in trying to achieve those successes? How do you respond to those obstacles? What do you need to overcome those obstacles? We need some very careful note takers at each table, and I realize that that probably means that someone isn't participating as much as they'd like to because they're busy taking notes, but we definitely need your notes. So could each table please designate a good note taker who will actually write details down about these cases? We as the faculty team will be coming back to these cases as part of our ongoing work with Food for Peace. It will also be of interest to the strategy process. When it comes to what goes on flip charts, and we'll pass out these little flip charts at the end. So we want 2 things to go up on flip charts. On the one hand, as you're listening around your table, what are some common types of successes that you're having related to working, trying to address conflict situations? And then the other one is, what are some of the common obstacles? And so when we're sharing out with the group, we're going to focus on those common successes and those common obstacles, and the people who are sharing out will have an opportunity to give specific examples. When we wrote up the success, we were thinking about A, B, and C program, and this is what they were doing. So that's what will go on the flip chart. Again, you have the papers on your tables. Please do share kind of in, only 2, so maybe put one on one end of the table and one on the other end of the table, so everyone can see. I do have 1 or 2 more. Oh, and it will go up on the PowerPoint. So share your examples. We'll also have the instructions about what was up on the flip charts up here on the flip chart. And enjoy your conversation. You have until 11:15, and then we'll take a break. And so we'll make sure maybe around the 11 o'clock mark that you're writing on your flip charts. Okay? Enjoy. All right, folks, we need to get started. Thank you, Sheila. Okay, it seems like we've had some really rich discussions, so rich that you all missed all the good food outside. Did everyone get what they needed? Okay. So it looks like we've got a great list of obstacles and successes from 3 groups, plus the group online. So we're excited to hear about these, and it'll be interesting to hear what resonates among the groups and what's different. Let's see, in terms of time frame, we have 45 minutes. And so as you're reading these off, as you're reporting out, maybe if you could also provide very, very, very briefly examples. What were the examples you were thinking about when these points got up on the list? So that would be helpful to give people some context to some grounding what the points up there in the examples you have from your programs. So why don't we start with this table over here? Who's you're speaking? Excellent.
So we started, we have a list of items that we were discussing. So for some of the successes and some of the things that we saw among different program examples was the importance of involving the non-traditional technical expertise and having a conflict management or a conflict person, for example, be able to review and work on the design and the implementation to really add value to these programs and their design. Other key things that were very successful are mapping both the systems as well as the stakeholders. And this was really getting at looking more at the enabling environment. One of the examples we had is a Mercy Corps program that one of the objectives was explicitly about working on the conflict management system in northern Nigeria for this livelihood strategy program. And if we didn't have that element of assisting the enabling environment so that when conflicts came up between the cattle raiding and everything, then we weren't really allowing for a sustainable impact in that area. So, and that looking at the enabling environment and how we could impact that came through a very conscious sit down of what are the systems in place, what is the government, institutions, what are the cultural institutions, clan members, clans that are important in the system, as well as who are the stakeholders. And we talked here about how even choosing the stakeholders is a difficult process, and getting that right should be a focus of the program. Another we brought up the challenge of having good communication strategies when working with, and especially when we're in a context where there's IDPs and host communities, and why food is being distributed to one group and not the other, and the importance of one of the programs had regular communications out to the community so that was constantly at the forefront, even though I think we could have just communicated once. But, check that off our list. But the important thing then was in regular communication. And then again, we talked about success being flexible in this programming, and as we come up and face different aspects of the program, and being able to adapt that. And then for our obstacles,
So in terms of the obstacles, we were looking at the timing in which is allowed for the program design, and the limitations put on, say, an emergency operation request versus what would be allowed in a multi-year development request. Yeah, no problem. Can you hear me? And then moving forward for that, in the design process, when you have flexible, adaptable programming, an obstacle may be that they may not be able to pivot, particularly when you're looking at large resource allocations or pre-positioning. That can't necessarily be changed to reflect what needs to be done. Also, obstacles would be in the design, the usual actors in terms of technical expertise may be consulted, and those silos really just reinforce in any adaptation or further on of a project that those same people keep getting consulted, and there isn't necessarily the involvement of the other non-traditional technical silos for a food assistance project. And then also this applies also to the resource siloing that you see between the different types of emergency typologies. And the unintended consequences of targeting was brought up as an obstacle. I think the discussion around this was about an example where we had a pastoralist, was this one? Yeah, the pastoralist group was coming into a community, and in order to reduce the conflict between the local community, the idea was brought up that the milk from the local community's livestock would be sold then, or purchased through the project and utilized in the IDP population. However, this brought up the idea of breast milk substitution, and it generated a lot of attention to the project, and it was an unintended consequence of trying to be sensitive to conflict mitigation. Balance then between, which goes, I think, a lot to the obstacle of time, is balancing program efficiency. A goal needs to be achieved quickly, beneficiaries need to be reached, yet also adapting the input from multiple different partners. How do we balance that? And that is a constant obstacle. Definition of conflict may limit what types of considerations are done in, say, an active emergency response or maybe a relief response. And then I think our last point was a lack of clarity being given at the onset in programs about requirements of conflict analysis and what is the definition that Food for Peace will utilize in conflict analysis. Is it necessarily what gets done as a conflict analysis sufficient enough? And I think, yeah, that's it. Those are the obstacles.
Hello, everyone. So online, we discussed several different topics and experiences in terms of opportunities. And here for our group, I'm skipping down to section 3. We talked specifically about finding ways to use a participatory approach to involve beneficiaries in leading program success. An example from ADRA, from Guillermo Lizarraga, was in Somalia, where they have a voucher for work program. And one of the key factors to avoid conflicts was to have a very close relation and coordination with the local community leaders, specifically village elders. And by giving selection criteria to the community in order to help identify who should be involved in activities, planning, implementation, and monitoring, they were able to really have success from the program. The beneficiaries really felt ownership of interventions, and the situation alleviated any potential conflict context. In a similar vein, in Ethiopia, in the T2FS program, we incorporated a do no harm approach in community planning, especially in water development, by including participants from the RADAs in specific trainings geared towards conflict-sensitive planning, and specifically on natural resource-related conflict issues and infrastructure development and management. We also discussed how it's important to make sure that you build at some point the capacity of the people who are affected by the conflict, and not just go in and facilitate a temporary intervention, but make sure that you have something that can sustain itself when the program ends. In terms of our gaps that we saw and obstacles, in Ethiopia we discussed the conflict and the complex nature of the insecurity in our program areas, from clan rivalry to heated battles between the state and non-state actors in both Ethiopia and Somalia, as the program works along the border, and how complicated this has been from the original initial program assumptions, and how insecurity in conflict-prone program areas can really affect and impact the potential achievement of program interventions. In fact, many of the office staff can't travel to the Somali region from the main office. And given this, we really need to be open to new ways of operating, creative in terms of the activities that we do implement and monitor, and or in the challenge of not being able to implement, finding out ways to reconsider activities and resources and how they're being used. We also discussed how challenging it can be for the arrival of IDPs in a community, and how that can affect the local framework of authority. We talked about the fact that people arrive into a community and may not be willing to follow and respect the local leaders and traditions, and how that really presents a challenge. And finally, we talked about how you build community trust in the nature of a conflict zone, and how you can cooperate with parties in a conflict, and how challenging that can be, since time can be against your organization while planning. So that's our online discussion.
Questions of clarification for group online? No, screen. Okay, let's go to my table. Mara, do you want to? Okay, at our table, first of all, in terms of the successes, we talked about, several people mentioned reducing dividers by being inclusive and not just addressing the most vulnerable, and that to some extent gets to the fact that, you know, often we're working in environments where you've got a multicultural, multi-ethnic group kind of situation, but you may also have IDPs and host populations, so ensuring you're addressing the needs of both and all. And then not contributing to power struggles. I think the example that was just given about Somalia was a common experience for those working in Somalia, but also in other contexts. Understanding what the power dynamics are and not aggravating them. Building community cohesion through group activities, school activies, and so forth, and things in terms of the school activities addressing all ages, I guess early childhood through youth, including women and girls, and here talking about workforce development, and sometimes that's really focusing on vocational skills for youth is very important so that they can enter the job market. But this whole area of group activities was very important. Just the building of community cohesion was something that everybody felt was critical, and the example of Food for the Hungry in DRC was very important, showing how they had farmers groups and village savings and loan associations and so forth, and how that really created an opportunity for people who might normally fight with one another were in fact cooperating, and that helped to build community cohesion. And that can reach across also different religions, different groups, and so forth. In terms of, and WFP has had tremendous success with the school activities because it creates some stability within the community, which is also important. And then there was a whole area we talked about in terms of resource management, livelihood enhancement, agriculture, and rebuilding infrastructure. And in this case, it's very much the whole idea of first creating some stability in terms of infrastructure and social services, but then also, in some cases, reducing drivers by creating a situation where resources are managed equitably and effectively at the community level, rather than there being a conflict over them. Sometimes what that means is that the conflict has to get resolved ahead of time. We talked about land use and where there have been some land conflicts, land tenure conflicts, and where those things need to be resolved quite often before you can go in and implement infrastructure and other types of activities. So that has to be well managed. Another thing that came out interestingly was making available information to people. And I say here information for peace building, but it can also be information about what types of resources are available for people, what's happening where, making sure that people know what's going on so that they can access essential needs, and also promoting messages, positive messages about reducing conflict and building peace. And then finally, one thing that WFP talked about that was very, very important was linking to national peace building strategies. So if there, we can maybe have, as NGOs, a very positive impact at the community level, but we may not be looking more beyond that in terms of whether there are strategies that we can support that are already in place in terms of peace building. So ensuring that we're consistent with this and we're supporting that is important. And in many ways, these successes are addressing some of the challenges. So, for instance, we have down here political considerations is one of the challenges, okay? But it could be even broader than that. It could be that we're not taking into consideration certain political issues that exist, and we're trying to fight against them or address them in a way that is not going to be effective. So that kind of links to sometimes not acknowledging program capacities and limitations, trying to fly in the face of where we really can't do anything, okay? So that's important. Another one that we acknowledged was that it's very hard to build staff capacities to work on conflict effectively. So there doesn't seem to be much attention to that. If the programs are not focused on that, you may not have those resources in place or the tools to do that kind of training. Another one was, well, everybody kind of said we really don't know how much we actually are, in fact, having an impact on reducing the drivers of conflict or improving peace building or whatever, because we're not really measuring it. And we don't know if what we're doing is actually having an effect on reducing conflict or not. Because if there isn't a conflict, we could say, well, there isn't a conflict, so we don't know. You know. So once again, it's a chicken and egg issue there, lack of indicators. Also, we may be doing a lot of positive stuff. We're measuring it in terms of food security and reduction in malnutrition and so forth. We're not measuring, how we're impacting drivers of conflict. And then some practical issues, I think, lack of access and security in areas that are severely conflict affected and where, in fact, the greatest good could be done. You can't really get to them. There's a hierarchy of needs. In an active conflict situation, the first needs are going to be food, water, shelter, and, reduction of displacement, saving lives. So when do you get at conflict mitigation as a result of that? The fact that situations are dynamic, okay, and changing, and you never know where the conflict is. You don't know who is involved. In the DRC, they have to constantly assess the situation. Also, the different drivers at different times, understanding that as well. One thing that came out that was kind of interesting was this language communication issue. People speaking different languages, okay, meshed together. And how does that impact the situation? We saw that as a barrier. And then, of course, addressing the needs of underserved groups, youth, women, etc., different impact groups. And then finally, resource limitations for programs. And in this case, it was, okay, there's so many going on at one time, there's not enough to go around, but also, are we maybe missing some opportunities because resources are being devoted to certain things and not others? Maybe there's not an active conflict situation somewhere, but there could be the seeds of conflict existing, and we're not addressing them because the resources are not in place.
Thanks for any clarification? Let's go to our last group at the back table.
Okay, so the sort of the successes that we identified were from the patterns of successes across the different types of programs and the different contexts that were mentioned. The key one, and this actually came up in almost everybody's example, was that analysis, a good analysis that was early, participatory, thorough, and this should be FFP funded. As you'll notice, also mirroring that on our obstacles board, that analysis is often unfunded. That is something that is therefore then has the potential to create some competition about individual organizations' analyses, that they become proprietary and are not shared, and so that the common understanding of the situation is not held in a place that other people have access to, and that they can then refer to it within RFA. Some resources, the next success we identified was the resource availability. In terms of, and we had a couple of examples, like linkages of cross-cutting, is this another linkages of cross-cutting issues?
Yes, so that's where
yeah. Integrating conflict and food assistance and gender and governance and linking it with other thematic areas of programming. Assessment guidance being a resource, and feedback mechanisms, the information, the data gathered from feedback mechanisms as a resource for understanding the context. Accountability and transparency, where organizations were able to have an ongoing relationship and close feedback loops with communities, and therefore as an accountability mechanism, but also then be clear about what expectations should be. That helped them to address conflict dynamics. Flexibility, which has been mentioned by almost every group, I think, as being able to adapt to changing circumstances was a key of success. And then theories of change, and this is kind of linking to the flexibility and adaptation, that analyses and theories of change need to be reviewed on an ongoing basis in order to make sure that programming is adaptive. Other ones on the obstacle side, one of the major issues that was brought up was the siphoning off of aid. That as programs are bringing in resources, some of those are co-opted. The nature of emergency programming reduces capacity and willingness and time to do no harm, to do conflict analysis. What RFAs are requesting, so what is being requested is what is being delivered, but if they're not requesting conflict considerations, then the organizations aren't going to deliver them. And money and interest are not mutually aligned with expectations in terms of a continuum of conflict sensitivity and peace building. Yes, would you?
So what we're talking about is often the RFA will ask for us to develop programs that will contribute to peace writ large, the sort of larger root causes and drivers of conflict, but with the resources and frankly the interest are only contributing to peace writ small, something at the community level, which is important, but certainly doesn't address those root causes and drivers.
Thank you. The team effort. And finally, exogenous factors, so other factors in the context that are affecting the conflict that the organization has no control over, maybe can't even predict, but that they have to be responsive to. That makes it it's an obstacle to being completely conflict.
Great. So as everyone was listening, let's first talk about the successes. As everyone was listening to each group talk about their successes or reflecting on your conversations at your tables, were there any surprises? Did anyone provide an example you said, wow, I wish we could do more of that?
I actually have a clarification question. It's about the analysis and whether or not it's Food for Peace funded. Is the issue whether or not we fund the PVO or the partner to do it, or is it a matter of who does it and whether they make that information available? It seemed like there were two issues, and I wanted to unpack it a bit.
There were, and I think what we tried to capture, perhaps more elegantly there, was that there are indeed two issues. So it's that there's sort of protection of analysis that happens when it's done because it's not a funded activity, because it's either not generated at a level that, for instance, if FFP had an analysis that they were then sharing with partners and they were using that to incorporate, and I'll ask my group to further develop this thought, that would be something that could kind of fall under this resources available category. So that they were as they were presenting their plans, they would be based upon a sort of macro level analysis, and that because the funding wasn't there to do analysis on an individual basis, that was an output of resources that an organization has to make in order to even get to the point where they could submit a proposal. So it was also sort of a cyclical issue, and so my group has something to add.
Just as a follow-up and clarification, is there a sense then that if a partner were to do a conflict analysis, we would not allow that in the budget, and you would have to use your own resources? I'm just trying to understand that. I haven't heard that before. So
there's a couple issues. I think the first point here is, this is just like with the contractors too. If you do a really good analysis, it could potentially be a differentiator. It's what's going to set you apart and help you to win the award, right? However, what we think would be better to ensure that no matter who gets the award, Food for Peace gets the best possible, best quality programming, is that there should be funding made available to do, after, let's say, an initial analysis, a much more thorough analysis. This is what Food for Peace already requires for gender, for example. And so let's see it extend to peace building and conflict issues. The other issue, and I started by putting it up there on those sheets, is, we do peace building, integrated peace building, but when we've written them into proposals, food for peace has said take it out. And those are two examples where we put integrated peace building activities within the larger development food or multi-year assistance programming. And these are horrific conflict environments. And Food for Peace said, for a variety of reasons, that's too complex. We don't, government can do it better. Take it out. And so we said, well, okay, but we're still going to do it because we know it's important, and we'll just use our own money.
I also wanted just to clarify a question about the analysis. Part of the reason I asked is to state who I am. My name is Susan Peter. I work at ICF, and we are the organization that conducts the baseline study for the Title II Human Development Assistance Program. So my question is naturally, analysis of what? Because we are people who collect the baseline data, and that data goes for the purposes of establishing a baseline, but then sits unanalyzed. So I don't know if you're talking about analysis that would happen much before that, or what the future sort of that data is.
We, regardless of whether or not Food for Peace is going to ask for it, at Conflict Services, peace building, governance, and gender is a core competency for us. And so for any award above $1 million, we're going to ask people to do a conflict analysis and governance assessment and a gender analysis. And let's keep it on conflict because that's what we're talking about. We now have a good enough guide to do an assessment for all three of those areas. And in conflict, it's really just about a dozen questions that we expect the design team to undertake along with other partners. It could be, just a couple-day desktop analysis, or preferably, they actually go out and do a series of key informant interviews, focus group discussions. When I've done this, typically, a couple weeks at the most, and it should very much be integrated into the ensuing design workshop so that your activities reflect conflict sensitivity, or if you're going to be more intentional to address the root causes and drivers, you have components that are designed specifically with that in mind. And this is, I think, best practice. You need to be designing your evaluation at the time of the design process so that you are measuring the changes and ultimately the effect.
Any other questions of clarification for that group?
Well, it is, I guess, kind of a clarification, but I mean, we're talking about sort of analysis during the sort of the design phase, but I'd be curious as well as whether or not there's latitude within implementation, right? So as part of being flexible and adaptive to the context, the ability to really invest in ongoing conflict analysis. And so is that a part of the challenge, or is there more latitude to have, to put in budget lines that would allow for that sort of deep analysis throughout implementation, which is different than sort of the pre-proposal stage that all implementers are doing.
Any of the folks from CDA will tell you here that a conflict analysis is only as good as it is current. And so I would say periodic update is important. But one associated comment, which we talked about a bit, which is, all right, so I come from peace building and governance, and I think this is important, and I'd like to see it done more, obviously. But when I go out to my colleagues who are responsible for designing the overall program and ultimately implementing them, this is only a long list of things that they have to do in order to get the proposal design and ultimately the project implemented. So the challenge is put back on me, and rightfully so. For instance, this guide, like I said, 10, 12 questions. They don't want, they won't use anything that's, very exhaustive, as much as I'd like to see it. But then even in implementation, how can we keep it simple so that maybe when they're going out and they're, looking at how we can have accountability and transparency, the feedback mechanism, we're making sure that we're contextualizing it so that it does take into account some of these factors that honestly can make or break our program.
So anything from the online group? Okay, great. So back to the question of, as you all talked at your tables and you talked about successes in terms of affecting, addressing the conflict situation, were there any big surprises? Wow, I wish we could do more of that. And could anyone talk about that case and what made it possible? We heard at our table a lot. Oh, sorry.
I can't actually go into the full detail of the way you phrased your question, but one thing that struck me as well in this table was the business of accountability mechanisms, and they're talking about ways in which organizations have made themselves accountable to their beneficiary or the community population they serve. And that included such things as comment boxes, or even more currently telephone numbers, where people, if they have cell phone service, can call in. But I think the point that I want to make is that I think this was something that I feel is refreshing and needs to be refreshed as we implement projects, which is incorporating more and better accountability mechanisms, so that when we do the surveys on the exhaustive list of indicators that we sit down and talk to families on, for example, that we go back and tell them what we found out. I mean, what conclusions we're drawing from those sorts of things. That comes under the transparency part as well. So I think these accountability mechanisms are increasingly important and necessary in order to help incorporate the community's concerns and help reduce levels of tension, suspicion, resistance, or even ideas that certain parts of the community may be favored over others, and so on.
For those of you that are interested in that topic as well, I see some faces that were not there at that discussion, what was it, 2 weeks ago on social accountability. There was a very, very robust discussion about what it would look like and what are the considerations we need to take into account in increasing and in building social accountability systems, both in our own work and in the countries that we work in. So you can look for that online on fsnetwork.org. They have the meeting recording, and there will be more materials coming soon.
I thought from our table, building on the social accountability idea, that the information got shared. And I wonder if someone from our table would want to talk about programs where there's information sharing as a way of reducing tension. Alan, you had something to say.
You know, there are circumstances where WFP's done programs where the food assistance has been linked with complementary NGO activities that involve training and information sharing that's specifically targeted in peace building. You know, because of course it's a multilateral organization, I'm not sure I can always trace those, whether they were directly supported by Food for Peace, and I think some of the complementary activities were supported by the funds and other funds going to the implementers. But I mean, I've been trying to look at my Cote d'Ivoire example here so that I can give exact good description of what they had in mind that they did in Cote d'Ivoire, where they did have like the NGO that they were implementing food aid assistance programming was also doing community communications and peace building type training and conflict reduction training, in addition, essentially designing the food aid program so that they were specifically linked to community ownership and community cohesion and all the other things, but then also using as a platform for broader education and communication messaging of that kind.
Any final, we have about 5 more minutes, so we could talk about any other examples that were impressive. I thought we heard a lot of examples here about community level work. Did you have one of those you're talking about? Why don't you go ahead and volunteer somebody else.
I was wondering if another way to share the Northern Uganda example in that program, sort of the integration of those 3 components. And if the question is, wow, could we do more of that?
One of the programs that Mercy Corps has growing is a DFAP in Northern Uganda and Karamoja, and it's called the Growth, Health, and Governance program, GHG. And it has 3 components, and one is working on the livelihoods, strengthening livelihoods among pastoralists and agro-pastoralists. Also a nutrition component, and then the 3rd component is strengthening the conflict management system in that area. And I think so that has there's a definite goal of contributing to peace in that area through like we mentioned, sort of helping the enabling environment around some of these conflicts that are around cattle raiding and livestock issues, but having mechanisms that are in place, and they exist both by the government and by the clan structure, but strengthening those aspects so that as we're in there implementing and working with the communities, that we're also helping create a more sustainable impact because we have that aspect of working within the big, broader structure. So I think, I'm not sure though, and some of the questions we had is just, I'm not sure where that came from, and have to go back to all the working with the people who designed it, if that was a request from Food for Peace, or how we were able to get that type of program, because that's unique, and I think it's something that's interesting to look at in terms of as a program that we could do elsewhere.
Any final words? Any final words on this discussion? This has been very helpful for us. Note that the Factors team will be following up with some of you about your specific examples as we continue our work. But now I think we can wrap up this part of the discussion, and we have another 15 minutes to go and get your boxed lunch and come back in here for our final plenary discussion, which Joan will lead, about the Food for Peace strategy and the incorporation of conflict and conflict response in it. Okay, so you've got 15 minutes to go get your lunch.
From everyone around the successes and the challenges. There's some questions, but I think we have to parse the question a little more than I thought we would have to. But one of the real questions for us is, how far do we go on the spectrum in our work? I mean, the case has been made today that there have been times when partners have put forward plans to carry out integrated peace-building activities, and Food for Peace has said, no, that's too far, that's too much, that's not what we do. And there are special cases, like we heard in the example of Uganda, where for some reason it did come to pass and it was warmly embraced, and it could be a matter of personalities. But it is because we're still working from a perspective where 10 years ago, when the last strategy was written, Food for Peace really did feel that most conflict mitigation and peace building was beyond the manageable interest of Food for Peace. And there was a much stronger tendency back then to focus on maternal child health and nutrition, and agricultural and livelihoods, and that's the world that we work in, and let's focus on that, and let's avoid dilution of efforts. And I think there's been a tremendous amount of learning from experience that we have to integrate this a little better in order to achieve the results we're trying to achieve in food security. Conflict is a huge driver of food insecurity, and we need to address it at some level. So the question is, I think we do need to parse it a little, though, that maybe the questions are different for emergency contexts and development contexts. We start with emergencies. What could we reasonably expect moving forward? What could Food for Peace reasonably expect from its implementers working in emergency contexts? If we look at this spectrum again, we've got it up on the screen too. Pardon?
Avoid negative effects.
Okay, because as this group noted, the nature of emergency programming reduces the capacity and willingness to even do no harm. So it makes it difficult to even do that. So is this a reasonable expectation, though? That it's not okay, even if prevailing forces make it easy to avoid this kind of focus, can we agree that it's probably a basic necessity in every situation that we do ask
every implementer, no matter what the situation, that this is the bare minimum that should happen, right? Okay.
I think it's fine as far as a baseline, but I think we're missing a big opportunity if we just stop there. And just to say, this isn't about Food for Peace, this is about us too. I mean, my own agency, what we're doing now in Central African Republic, it's not Food for Peace, but the programming is similar. We have, the humanitarian response side of the house, and then we got the social cohesion side of the house, and unfortunately the twain have not yet met.
And I appreciate.
Come together, our own community doesn't come together. Always fun for each.
Yes, I appreciate that. But yes, let's look at this and maybe we can reach consensus. From our perspective, this is a baseline. It's the barest minimum that we should be avoiding doing harm in every situation and understand where that harm could arise from. And it is not just about Food for Peace, but you're right. It's about partners and how they work and how they come together and how we work throughout USAID. So you were going to say something?
I was. And I would like to add to this, I think there's agreement. I'm sensing that this is a reasonable expectation in the emergency contexts. But one of the other things that I heard was that striving to avoid negative effects, to do no harm, can also be incredibly challenging. So it being reasonable is not equivalent to it being easy.
Yes.
And I think it's important to flag that, and maybe we can talk a little bit about what gaps, what things we need to accomplish in order to make it more doable.
And that's part 2 of this conversation, yes. Both within Food for Peace and how we facilitate strong programs in your own organizations and how they facilitate strong programs. What can we do that would improve that? So staying on emergencies for a minute. Brian, you had a comment?
Well, I do need to, my thought, follows on from that, and I don't need to anticipate what your second half was there, but because a lot of emergency response is driven by a sense of urgent best intention, it's easy to assume that there are not going to be negative effects from doing food interventions. And the question really in avoiding negative effects for us would be, what becomes the practice standard for do no harm across the community so that we don't just try to avoid negative effects, but in fact we use that as a filter and a screen for the kinds of interventions that we then use, and by what assessment tool informs that confidence that we're not going to have
and following on to that, I think there's some really big issues, like what's the context when more than one organization is responding to an emergency. Some of these bigger issues, and I think governance has elements of this, every organization shouldn't be running off on its own trying to figure out the context for sheer inefficiency. But there should be ways in which we can be coming together and maybe rapidly getting some better idea of the picture.
My comment kind of is building on this as well, and it goes to the challenge of language and communication. And I think there's a real stark difference in the field of humanitarian response between organizations that have a pure humanitarian mandate and the multi-mandate organizations in terms of how they interpret conflict sensitivity as a tool to help them improve their impact in conflict situations. And so I think there's going to be a fine line of really fleshing out that understanding and making sure that there's not that much room for interpretation about what we mean when conflict sensitivity is required.
I was just going to say that in terms of building on positive effects, it seems as if maybe there would be a role that we could play going forward of us going back into our organization, seeing if we have can gather more data, written materials that may already exist, such as your Cote d'Ivoire example and the many other examples, so that then they could be housed within food for peace, because in terms of doing a better job of building on the positive effects, I think that we could do a better job of compiling the knowledge and case studies of the examples that are already happening, that are either Food for Peace partially funded or funded by other parts of USAID, so that there's much more of a knowledge flow of specific examples, and then people would know which organizations to go to ask about these specific examples.
Or it could be the topic of a top-select effort to bring organizations together, which builds on what Jen Jennings was saying. Yeah.
I have kind of a question because I'm not really focused in emergencies very much, but I do know that in most emergency situations there are clusters. There's a nutrition cluster, there's a food security cluster, all these clusters that focus on these technical areas to address basic needs within the emergency. And they usually develop these strategies and they try to coordinate to the best extent they can, but I don't know whether there is a strategy that focuses on conflict mitigation or addressing conflict situations. And one of the things that Alan raised was this idea that, if there's an overall strategy, it's best to try and coordinate and support it as a way to have a greater impact than just, working at a community level and trying to, reduce negative effects and so forth. So I'm just wondering aloud whether that might be a new focus, a potential focus within emergency responses, which would be broader than just food for peace, obviously. But then, so that it's not, so that whatever activities are food supported by Food for Peace are in fact looking at it, supporting a broader strategy as opposed to just, doing different things within those technical clusters.
Okay, so it gets back similar to what Joan Jennings raised as well. I think there's a lot of room for better coordination and understanding of what all the other parties are doing in these very fast-paced environments where we're there for a short time, but I think it makes that sharing of information and practices and strategic goals all the more important because we are there for a short time with an enormous amount of resources. Okay, that's really helpful. So we have kind of morphed into this, what would help to improve moving up along this spectrum and ensuring that we at least get this far. Let me just finish this question first though. Is there potential? I mean, is that an expectation it's fair to have in emergency situations? Or is it really specific to the context?
I think it probably is specific to the context in a large degree, but I think we look at case studies around areas where we have perhaps missed the boat a little bit. And I would look at South Sudan in terms of the churches and their availability, and that we could have built on. Some people did, and I think, but I don't think all of us did. I think CAR is probably another instance, where you have the religious leaders who we should be working much more with, or should have at the outset, let's say, maybe we are now at the outset. So I think, to go back to what Erin from Sierra said, it's not to miss that opportunity. I mean, yes, this is the basics of what we should be trying to achieve, but we should be scanning the environment for the potential to at least build upon.
So it gets back to that need for ongoing analysis of these are rapidly changing environments, even just the conflict vulnerable ones. And so how do we build processes in that are going to allow us to get that kind of information with red flags in time? To realize you may need to change plans and mobilize other communities, strengthen social cohesion to a great, maybe reallocate some of your resources. Okay.
I thought on an emergency program, and this gets to the question we had about the typology, the different typologies, and so there's the rapid onset emergency response, which maybe do no harm would be a big stretch and that we wouldn't try to go any further. But then the protracted emergencies. And so if you're talking about emergency funding is still going for the Syrian refugees, etc., like that, the DRC funding, which is protracted, is there more opportunity in these protracted emergencies to put in some conflict mitigation elements?
It's more a question than a comment for you to answer. But I have thought part of the appeal or the utility of the resilience movement was that it was supposed to bridge the humanitarian response with the development. And so the idea is that, for instance, when we do disaster risk reduction work in some of the Food for Peace programs, that should be that kind of bridge that helps you to certainly keep an eye on the cyclical shocks that might and do come up, but also putting in mechanisms, whether it's at the community level or all the way up at the policy level through the Hyogo framework, that you are there to prevent shocks from becoming indeed disasters.
Any other thoughts? This is more sort of a question as to whether or not, in terms of building positive effects, that if organizations didn't feel that they had the capacity to do the peace-building positive effects work, if perhaps, would it help for there to be a list of some of the organizations, Search for Common Ground comes to mind, that have some of this expertise and that could perhaps be partners. But that just opens up to the question of whether we should be, interacting more with organizations that do have a great deal of expertise in this arena.
I'm not sure about putting together a list of organizations because it's an endorsement, but it certainly, I think, is something that if an organization itself is lacking expertise in an area, they should always be seeking out expertise that will help them to address the drivers of food insecurity they're likely to come across in their program. So, I think that's a good point.
Rather than making an endorsement for individual organizations, are you familiar with the Alliance for Peace Building? Go ahead and give Melanie Greenberg a call, and I'm sure she can connect you with the right people.
It speaks to that, but that also speaks to something too that, and I think, is it Aaron? You brought this up earlier. The linkages, and you brought it up earlier as well. The need for better linkages with beyond the Office of Food for Peace, but internally at USAID, we need better linkages with CMM and with the DRG office, and we're trying and we're doing that. And I think these consultations reflect some of that effort that we have started those dialogues. And we have found receptive partners on the other side, which is really wonderful. But just, it's a common theme then, isn't it? That how do you take that down to the program level as well? And make sure those linkages are there and the information is there so that our Food for Peace funded programs, that there is knowledge around what other programs are going on in the country and what other efforts are going on and what larger strategies it all fits into. So it really comes down to a lot of information needs and coordination.
Yeah, and I think, I think a couple of the consultations, I think, are not just this one, I've pointed out, to the extent the strategy brings in some of these broader issues, then Food for Peace itself needs to be more outward-looking and more engaged with the rest. And I think one of the challenges is going to be a lot of these issues and a lot of the structures to build these plans are addressed at the country level. And Food for Peace does have people at the country level, but it's still a far more centralized structure than aid missions, than the Secretary General's peacekeeping force. If you want to play in the committee, in the specifics, it's one thing to play here about the theory. It's another thing to play in the individual country processes, and I think that would be a very different look at how you played and what the role of Food for Peace officers, who I think primarily see their role in the monitoring of projects and the coordination of projects. It's an interesting, I don't have an answer to this question, but when you talk about integrating with a larger country strategy for peace building, I mean, most of those are developed at the country level. They aren't developed in Washington, or you know, in the UN, they're a lot more developed in New York than I'd like, but they still try to be at the country level.
Any other thoughts on where emergency work fits on the spectrum, or what would be necessary to help move our work along that spectrum?
I'd like to hear people talk a little bit about the protracted emergencies. And so, for example, if you've been working with Syrian refugees for a long time, if you've been in the DRC for a long time, emergency programming, what are the possibilities in your programs to not only avoid negative effects, but build positive effects? So that people could provide some examples.
Syrian refugees, I mean, there are a lot of reasons why the Syrian refugee program for food that the WP runs is all a voucher program and has essentially no commodity component. It's all a voucher program. 98%, except some new arrivals in Jordan, get their food through going to local stores and turning in vouchers. Now, there are a lot of reasons that was done, but one of the explicit reasons was because refugees were creating serious pressures on local political dynamics, potentially instability, particularly in Lebanon and Jordan. And the feeling was, if you have a system where these refugees are not in camps getting a standalone collection of food, but you're sending it to a system that reinforces local markets, that injects, in the case of Lebanon, something like $1 million every week into the local Lebanese economy, that will, you know, if the refugees are seen to some extent as customers of local merchants, that will reduce the stress. Now, it's not the only factor, but in fact, what analysis we have, it's hard to prove this. I mean, we can prove how much money it's injecting into the local economy. It's a little harder to say how much is it reducing the stress, but it was a conscious decision, one of several factors that went into almost exclusively using electronic vouchers in the Syrian refugee circumstance. And I think, at least anecdotal and evidence, is that in Lebanon and Jordan this has had some of the desired effect, reducing some of the conflict between host communities and local. The problem with Lebanon is that the refugee population seems so big that it's upsetting the basic ethnic balance within Lebanon. And it's just, you know, that there's only 1 million people of a different ethnic, not really so much ethnic, but a different grouping in a country that's already a powder keg like Lebanon is really challenging.
Okay. That is very helpful. Any other comments? I just wanted to, on that protracted crisis with Syria, I mean, I think the fact that you said that the vouchers, it's well thought through, it's market-based, but even, you know, that having a component to that program where you're actually, there's information sharing or there's a social cohesion component to that, you know, not particularly, you know, around food. It needs to be tied to that because the stresses in Jordan and Lebanon right now is before here. People are tired, the resources are strained, and then a lot of it is perceptions. Maybe that program really is helping, but you know, people are still going to be talking on the streets about Syrians doing this or Syrians doing that, and so having to add a component in order to make that voucher program even more effective, I think it's something to build a positive effect.
Move us further along the spectrum, even so there's potential in even the most difficult of situations. Okay.
Just kind of adding to that, you know, one thing came to mind in terms of implementing programs, that messaging is really, really important, because in a lot of contexts, there are going to be, obviously people are going to have very strong viewpoints about what's going on. They have
perceptions about who's at fault and why. So making it very clear, you know, maybe conveying messages that dispel some of these notions, I think is really important. So thanks for that contribution.
Just to add to Mara's point on messaging, I guess at our table at least we haven't yet talked that much about the use of technology and you know, the use of cell phones and messaging and WhatsApp and how these technologies can maybe be utilized in positive ways to make people aware of what the program is trying to achieve, where the resources are. I know that there are examples of programs. I know Normally Lagui in Haiti uses technology, but we could talk more about the positive uses of technology to push out information availability.
Let me ask a question because, and Catherine, you can maybe confirm that often in an environment like Syria, we're working in conjunction with other parties like UNHCR and OFTA, who may have roles to play in some of the service deliveries to the same population. So if we look at the food distribution, what are some possibilities for building social cohesion? I mean, we heard about using vouchers so that refugees are positively contributing to the community. What are some other avenues and possibilities in a refugee context what are some examples people can think of that we could move forward with, where there are opportunities to build social cohesion? Yeah.
I'll just share a concrete example. We have this wonderful program that's targeted for children, mostly, called No Strings, and it's a puppet show. A puppet show. And it is really aimed more at psychosocial healing at the individual level, but that for us, and we have a method we call the 3 Bs, binding, bonding, bridging. Bonding and bridging coming right out of CMM, people to people, peace building. But we feel that you can't really expect wounded souls to be engaged in any kind of social cohesion activity. So working at that individual level first, and by getting the children involved, it also obviously brings in the parents, and that's the way to get them more receptive to the kind of social cohesion, which I think there's some excellent examples that are already brought up, you know, working with the associational groups, etc.
Just building off of that, there's also child-centered spaces where children come together and do plays and playing sports and various things, either during the conflict, immediately after the conflict, to build social cohesion. And then there's early childhood centers. There's centers for very vulnerable people, widows, coming together and doing common things together. And a lot of this could be done with Food for Peace funding, I think, in conflict-affected areas.
I'd say there's sort of a general comment really about looking at the needs and relationships that organizations have with host communities and how they're engaging them in these kinds of, in any kind of program. The needs are obviously going to be different from a refugee community, but they do still have needs, and especially when there's an added stress, economic and social stress of a refugee community.
So complementary programming to really focus on community needs directly as well. Okay, that's great. Great suggestion. Okay. Joe?
I think this is a question. Sort of comments last. A little bit sad when you don't know what punctuation is coming at the end of your comment. We're using social cohesion as shorthand to describe some sense that the likelihood of conflict is less between groups. And often the thing that is driving conflict between groups has a lot to do with their existing government. And in
emergency contexts, typically, but not always, typically something about the existing government is in crisis. Does that mean that it's not advisable to try to do something to improve relations between groups of people and their governments? Are there limits to what we can do, improving social cohesion with respect to improving the relations between people and their governments in the emergency context?
You weren't here for our social accountability session, so put it in plug again, but the recording is available online, and I can send you the roughness on that, because it really does look at, there's a lot that Food for Peace does in terms of building that sense of connection between communities and the governments that deliver services to them, and how do we improve that, what does it look like, what are the necessary elements. We didn't get into a lot of detail about the emergency setting, but it's an area we're really talking through a lot internally, because I think there is room to improve that in that setting as well, and it's a matter of pulling together good examples and having a little bit, that often the majority of our funding goes to emergency settings, but the majority of thought goes into our development programs, because they're much more complex and there's much more room to really address local needs.
I'm not gonna say more than that, because I was gonna say, but not so much in emergency programs, all the programs where we're talking about governance.
Yeah.
So, I'm wondering if there are different dynamics that we need to take into account, though, in those situations. We're used to working in stable countries and where there are stable governments and so forth, and building, doing sort of governance work. Even there, we're not doing as much as we could.
Mm-hmm.
So then, I think this adds another element to it, an element of complexity and so forth that maybe we're not as
we're not as good at, yeah. And we do need to discuss more explicitly going forward. But yeah. All right. Well, it's a good segue to the development programming. We've social accountability and building social cohesion has come up. It came up in our social protection event last week as well. I'm glad social accountability was the first event, because it kept coming up. You can't have good social protection programs without really having a strong understanding of community needs and a good connection between the people that live in a community and the government that's serving them. It's coming up again today as a really necessary element of social cohesion and understanding the drivers and the root causes of conflict and the dynamics in the situation. So I think, I think we have a pretty strong consensus from the community that we're going to really try to increase our emphasis on governance going forward. And that will help in strengthening, I think, conflict sensitivity in our programming. But let's start with the same question again. In the context of development programs where we've got 5 years and much more complex multi-sectoral efforts, longer time to build connections in the community, understand the communities we're working in, where do we feel that we, no question, we should be doing this? How far do we go along the spectrum in terms of the expectations we have for ourselves and the work we do? I know what Erin will say, because she told us already, and that's okay. And it's come up internally in Food for Peace. Again, it's come up at other consultations. We are Food for Peace. Shouldn't we always be contributing to peace? Shouldn't it always, it's such a driver of food insecurity conflict is, that shouldn't we always be striving to contribute to peace? But is it always possible?
A little bit of framing around this discussion too, because I've been wanting to make this comment and I'm sort of waiting for the right moment. I wonder, I'm just trying to get a sense from the conversation, whether or not we have too tight an aperture around what counts as building positive effects. So I want to offer a comment to maybe widen the aperture a little bit, because I have a sense in the room that we're conflating building positive effects with actually directly contributing to peace. And you can see on the graphic, it's natural to conflate them. There's actual overlap there, and it's sometimes hard to separate them. But my comment is this: when I was presenting earlier in the morning, I was talking about fragility as an enabling condition for conflict, and I was talking about it as a relationship. Fragility is a characteristic of the relationship between state and society. To me, any activity that is in some way improving that relationship, improving the extent to which the relationship is behaving with legitimacy, or improving that relationship in the way it behaves in terms of effectiveness, doing something to make that relationship more capable for delivering goods to people. Either one of those dimensions, legitimacy or effectiveness, any activity that works in those lanes is doing something to tackle fragility, and in turn is doing something to build positive effects towards reducing conflict vulnerability. That's the way I think about it, and I think if you think about it in that way, that really widens the aperture about the kinds of activities, especially in development assistance, that would count, towards building positive effects. This observation may have no value at all because you're already thinking of it that way. But if you're not, and you're thinking more in terms of very concrete activities that are really focused in some way on peace building, if you're thinking about things that way, that's a very narrow aperture. That's a much smaller set of activities, and it's a little bit more limiting. Those are important activities, but that's a high bar. So I kind of want to lower the bar, and maybe that opens up some thinking about what would count in this way.
And I actually like the way that it's been framed today. That rather than saying a conflict mitigation, which almost says, conflict is it's there and we just have to keep it down. I mean, instead it's this more positive orientation that, build the strengths in the communities we work in, with the governments we work in, that will enable peace down the road. So it's a more appreciative approach, I think, to frame it this way, which I appreciate.
I just wanted to say, I think it would be helpful if we came to some kind of, we don't have to do it now, but in general the question would be, what does one mean by positive effects? There are many development programs which are mostly about economic growth and mostly about livelihood improvements. That's great, unless a particular subgroup is seen to be a disproportionate beneficiary of those kind of opportunities, in which case it creates a sense of grievance. It's reported out through M&E systems as positive effects on livelihoods, trade, economic activity, and so forth, but not always positive in terms of cohesion or governance. It's not always positive even where you're creating positive economic effects if you have a rent-seeking, parasitic, often corrupt state, which then feels a lot more interested in those economic gains taking place, and comes in and is a more, a more negative influence, even where you're creating these positive effects. So I'd like to see a continuum of responsibility, and to see peace or to see positive effects specified a little bit more tightly there, so that conflict is such a major risk and spoiler for development investments, and so much development money has been wasted because of subsequent conflicts which basically erase it all. And so to me, it needs to be a primary consideration. It's not the only consideration, but stability needs to be, a sense of confidence about futures needs to be a precondition in some respect for willingness to invest in those kinds of circumstances. Otherwise, you don't create sustainable effects. You create short-term positive blips, which then trickle away. So.
Very good point. Thank you.
I
had sort of a question and comment. I feel as if I'd like to see everyone, as Erin, I believe, said, the importance of looking at things not only from a gender lens, but also from a lens of peace building and democracy. But the challenge is that when you look at contributing to peace and addressing and engaging key drivers of the conflict, I feel as if it's possible that some organizations that don't yet have enough expertise in this area might actually contribute to conflictual situations by engaging key drivers in ways that are not contributing towards peace. In other words, I think some organizations could do harm, wanting to do well, but doing the engagement without quite knowing how to do it. So that's kind of the challenge here. The 800-pound gorilla in the room is how do we move to this contributing to peace and do it in a way that is very well informed.
So it speaks to the need for there being greater capacity in the implementing community and greater capacity in the Food for Peace staff to recognize when there's a potential to do more harm than good.
Let me just say, because I bet you guys feel like we're asking Food for Peace to do it all. You're delivering food to people who need it when they need it. Now we want you to make the world a better place, and that's crazy. Well, but what I'm getting at is you shouldn't have to do it by yourself. I mean, you're part of USAID, you're part of the U.S. government, and so, getting to your point, assuming that there's programming in those other areas present, whether it's from USAID, U.S. government, or with other bilaterals or possibly multilaterals, and the whole idea of harmonizing, which is you're putting your efforts next to the others and making sure you're covering all the bases. And I think, that falls on us too at the level of implementing partner. And in fact, to its credit, he says, you will do this. You'll make sure that what you're doing is working hand in glove with these other similar kinds of programs.
Certainly. I mean, there's been a sea change in the way that USA Missions design our programs, and as a result, how we design our programs. I mean, those of you that remember seeing the Nepal RFA may realize that it did not even have a nutrition component, which is staggering in the world of Food for Peace. But we're not doing nutrition, but there were. The mission has a bilateral nutrition project, and it was seen as in working with the mission, helping them to achieve their overall country strategy, it made more sense. If they feel they have that covered, we should put our resources elsewhere. And so I think it speaks to there's an enormous opportunity for there to be more coordinated efforts at the design stage. Absolutely, that is happening, and I think we'll see down the road to what degree it actually works in implementation, because the implementation is a whole different issue. If they're bilateral, when they have a rebid and there's a 2-year delay and suddenly there's no nutrition programming in the country, that's a problem. And, there may need to be flexibility around what we do in the future. If we count on there being some wonderful, democracy and governance program that we will link with and, co-locate with, there's a lot that's out of our hands that we may depend on. And so I think the real difficulty going forward is how do you actually implement the level of coordination and collaboration and counting on each other that we have to carry out at USAID. But it's happening for the reasons you state, though, that this joint programming and the country level programming where they're trying to take into account the needs and the value added of each of the parties coming in with their resources. I think that's a hugely positive step if we can manage to do it well. And it's going to take, it's going to take our implementing partners working with the other implementing partners in the country, and that's something that I think everyone is hearing that call more and more, and there's a reason for it. Nobody can do it by themselves. There is no one at USAID or in any donor organization that can do it by themselves. So, but it does raise the issue, and it's something we've been struggling with in our strategy, that as we expand the areas where we're taking those little boxes off to the side and say we can't just leave it to other people. Like, how do we continue to make sure that we're focused on food security and results, and taking, managing those factors that feed into it in a way that is going to help us lead to that, and not being diverted by, well, let's become a governance program or let's become a conflict mitigation program, but again, partnering with the right people. So that's a challenge for us. Okay, so thoughts around what would, if we look at a development context, you know, there were some things that came up, I think, some of the obstacles. What would help us all to do it better beyond linkages and information? The subject of analysis came up, and I think from your table, the suggestion that it be something that Food for Peace do at the outset, I guess, at the design stage, when we put together country-specific information, there be some kind of, okay, I just want to understand that suggestion. What about ongoing analysis? Do people feel they have the skills and capacity to do that in their own programs? With the knowledge about where to link into to find the information you need to really, you know, it's come up a few times in a few conversations, just development context that become the rapidly changing circumstances. And
I think one of the things that was brought out here was availability of capacity for that. Particularly in the developmental programs, and just really in terms of, you know, how those programs are organized and what it is they're intending to accomplish. I think there are opportunities, but we're just not organized that way.
Quick question to ask people about what is it about rapidly changing conflict contexts that you want to know more about? I can think of two things that change rapidly in a conflict context. The location of fighting can change quickly, and the level of fighting can change quickly. Is there anything else you would add to that list?
Oh, sorry, but Carlisle had her first, but this will be quick. Yes, the extent to which there are collateral parties drawn into the polarization in rural areas. For example, in Nepal, when the conflict was going on, it was difficult to be neutral in a lot of areas, and people who had no interest in getting engaged in the fighting were either forced to support the Maoists or forced to support the government, and there were serious negative consequences for them if they didn't do that. So the idea of neutrality tends to go by the boards, and you can't say, I'm sitting this one out. So the extent to which the force lines from the conflict radiate out into what are maybe apparently uninvolved communities.
You know, consequence of where the fighting is involved is the displacement and the resources you have access to.
I would just say in the sense of conflict vulnerable environments too. Like, when are there tensions that are brewing that we should be more aware of? And I think you brought up an example earlier about South Sudan, right? Yeah, maybe if you'd like to share that. Okay, well, I think it was that if there had been, I mean, I think that was an emergency situation, but there could have been opportunities. If there had been better red flags, there could have been opportunities to really strengthen some of the work through your churches, and that you know, there are missed opportunities when people are broadsided by a conflict or tensions that arise between, whether it's on an intercommunity basis or whether it's on, you know, because of rival groups in a country. That there's too many examples of people just being broadsided by that because they, you know. It's the way USA has always worked, isn't it? That you go in and you do your analyses and then you start implementing, and then you do a midterm, and then you know, and you just keep driving down the road. So we have a question from online.
Comment from online. Megan, go ahead.
Yeah, so it's along a similar comment that's been made about where does we fit in, like what is the role for conflict sensitivity? Is it just doing assessments, a midterm, and then a final evaluation. And I guess my comment here comes from my M&E hat, which is I don't think that there's consensus on what we mean and what we're measuring in terms of conflict sensitivity. And in some ways, we only measure things we want to change or be aware of, and how what we're doing is affecting a context. And since we're not necessarily on the same page with metrics, I think that just doing an assessment and a final is not going to tell us that much. I think it needs to be something that we're incorporating in our reporting, our planning, our programming, and that in an ideal world, it's like a lens through which we're looking and should be a section of what our programs report on. And I don't know that lots of money needs to be thrown into assessment after assessment, external and additional indicators that require more time. I think that a few key questions, if there were consensus on what those questions are in terms of each context, in terms of conflict sensitivity, could really go a long way to determining, you know, how our programs, which are food security programs, have exacerbated conflict or promoted peace on the spectrum.
Okay, thanks, Megan. Ready? No? Okay, Brian.
Just wanted to suggest that in general, a greater importance for political economy analysis as part of the initial assessment can help to identify what the potential points of instability or insecurity might be around what we might consider obviously beneficial economic changes, for example, which we often promote. And the political economy matters hugely. The fairness, the equity, the regions of distribution matter hugely to how that is perceived. And now there's a moment where the star for political economy is rising again a bit. But that needs to be taken in as a design factor, I would say, in what we do, if we wish to be at least not doing more and hopefully doing much more positive.
And just a comment to something that just crossed my mind, in terms of within development programming and ensuring that we have some sort of conflict sensitivity program, wherever along the continuum it happens, is the huge benefit that can have when and if an emergency breaks out. Because you've already built up a whole support system of conviction for your reasons for being there. Like we have examples of it from Haiti, where that includes Food for Peace as well, but where we worked with the gangs in Port-au-Prince, and the earthquake happened, and they are the powerful in the community. We haven't taken away that power, but we had a whole cadre of people who had that power that helped us to gain access. And it was a massive advantage. I don't think it was perfect in every way, but it is something just to keep in mind, because a lot of context you will be working in will be the conflict vulnerable.
Yes.
Yeah. That may fall into those.
Yeah, excellent point. Thanks everyone. I think we're about 5-minute mark? 7-minute mark, okay. Okay, any other, you have your hand up again? Anyone over here? Okay. I'm not even,
Just more just a real quick comment, because when I think of sort of analysis, not to all the other types of analysis, and that's just sort of the big level, that's little economy, But what, I mean, I'm thinking from a rotation perspective is needing sort of that consistent sort of management guide, sort of that analysis that can be fed into sort of management, the management tool, and sort of, really at a very basic level, those 10 questions that, your team, your local team is asking themselves about what sort of impact, whether negative or positive, our program is having, and feeding that back in on a very consistent monthly basis. In addition to sort of perhaps more higher level analysis, but really having those program tools and management tools to really track and monitor and then adjust programming based on what you're finding out.
Yeah, and that culture of adaptive management that is going to allow, whether it's conflict related or related to other factors we need to be addressing, is just those systems in place managerially that will allow us to stop and reflect and look and incorporate it into how we move forward. It's really important.
I think also the other example that keeps coming to mind was the Food for the Hungry, and also WFP saying they know they have, they have some indication, stories about stopping conflicts in certain places, but through these approaches, but they're not measuring the indicators that would show whether or not they are in fact reducing specific drivers of conflict. That you've mentioned that, if we look at it more broadly and we do an overall analysis and we understand what those drivers are from the beginning and we focus our measurement on those things and see to what extent we're reducing them. And in a dynamic situation, I think also, repeating those measurements more frequently, in other situations maybe not so much, but that would help us, I think. We have to shine the light on those things as opposed to necessarily, we also have to measure, nutrition levels and food security levels and so forth, but there are other things as well.
This is another shameless plug. About 5 years ago, we developed what we call the globally acceptable indicator templates, except for justice and peace building. We said, no, how about just generally appropriate? And so we have roughly 18 performance measures or indicators with about 3 or 4 pages of guidance on what we're talking about and how to use it. And it falls into 3 important categories, 2 of which I think would be relevant to what we're talking about here. What do you do beyond the initial assessment to keep track of what else you're looking for when you're in a conflict situation? So 3 categories are social cohesion, which very much looks at conflict. But then one of the biggest drivers of conflict we know is inequity, which is what you brought up. I thought was a brilliant point. And so we have 5 measures on equity. And then the third is more for just who we are as a faith-based organization looking at church action. Although certainly could be adapted to civil society as well. And you can find it at crsprogramquality.org. Shameless.
But that's a great library of tools.
And Bruce, if you would like to send that to the FSN network, we'd be more than happy to put it there too. So
they'll send it out in their newsletter. It's your resource. Yeah. Okay. All right. Final thoughts? Yeah.
I was just going to say that given that our discussion sort of is bringing up the reality that we have a long way to go in terms of increasing expertise around Food for Peace programming and conflict sensitivity, I was thinking that maybe every 6 months, at least over the coming couple of years, it could be helpful to get for Food for Peace to organize some sort of event where perhaps you bring in some Food for Peace implementers who have done conflict-sensitive programming, as well as some expertise outside of Food for Peace, such as the Alliance for Peace Building, some of these other groups that were mentioned, for them to share ideas, tools, expertise. So this is an ongoing sharing, because I think we're really just building our capacity in an arena that is somewhat new.
Yeah, there's been a small movement that way. I know Mercy Corps presented at the East Africa Knowledge Sharing meeting a couple of years ago that it was, and I think CRS presented as well, on the conflict early warning that they had in place in Sudan, and Mercy Corps and the Northern the Karamoja program and some of the dispute resolution and negotiation that had happened in that program. I think that was a workshop approach, and that was really, but I think that's just fair. There's been quite a call for better sharing and better collaboration amongst the PBOs on this issue. So yeah, hopefully there will be more, and maybe we can look to factors and CMM to help with some kind of follow-up down the road. Yeah. That's it. Now, I hear you will have to leave very soon.
Yeah, so something like
Yeah, certainly don't get your expectations up that I can somehow distill this fabulous conversation down into something, so I won't even try. But yeah, my apologies, I have to get back, so I'm going to peel out in a couple minutes. First off, I guess I'll just say that what we have wanted to accomplish today is to be able to listen to how you reflect on your work and to help us think about how your work, in one way or another, engages conflict, either with the attempt of just avoiding negative effects, or a little bit more, building positive effects, or actually contributing to peace building. And from my perspective, I've heard so much today, really just completely surpassed expectations, so I'm just really, really delighted. We have, as a team, a lot to really sift through and understand, but this has been enormously helpful for us. I hope that it's been helpful for you to be part of this exchange of experiences and perspectives. I want to thank, before I head out, Joan, who has made it so easy to coordinate with Food for Peace. We've got this great partnership working on this and helping us take advantage of this opportunity. We are early in our project, and to have this opportunity to sit with you right now, I can't tell you how valuable it is. So thank you very much, Joan, and thank you for office. So we will, as a team, we'll have a chance to debrief and think about what we heard today. I hope that my path will connect with lots of you. I've had a lot of interesting conversations on the margins, but look for, we'll be doing other kinds of events as we move forward to share some of the products that we hope to develop, and we will very much look for your reactions as we move forward. So thank you very much.
I'm going to hand the microphone over to Carla. Just thank you. What he said, it's incredibly valuable to hear from all of you. Every time we reach out to the community, we learn, and it makes our work better, and it makes, hopefully will feed back into systems that help you to do better work as well, and help you to do the work that you think should be done out there. So thank you very much for everyone's time and input, and stay tuned. We're not quite done yet. I think you have to summarize.
And we won't take, as Joe said, nor will I try to summarize all the richness of what we've heard today, but it has been so helpful to hear the variety of experiences. We as a team will get together and think about those highlights of what Factors has up next in terms of our work for Food for Peace. Is figuring out how we can help Food for Peace officers more systematically support these conflict-sensitive and at times conflict-mitigating peace-building efforts that you all are engaged in. And so we'll be reaching out to you again to gather some more case studies. You've given us hints of what those case studies might be. But we'll continue to work with you on this. So the payout for you all at the end of all this is that hopefully you'll see Food for Peace officers now with tools in the upcoming years or so that can help you do your work the way you want to do it. That's the goal. And it is such a pleasure to be working with Food for Peace. It's a wonderful partnership with CMM and Food for Peace, and we hope that it's going to be fruitful for all. We also want to give a thanks to TOPS for giving us this space, and obviously TOPS this wouldn't have happened without TOPS, with the organization and the facilitating the online participation, and so it's an exciting opportunity for a CMM contract to talk to a Food for Peace contract and to see ourselves coming together across these communities for a common goal, and so that's been really helpful. Sheila, you will be talking about with TOPS. The notes from this meeting will be going out of TOPS so that you all can benefit from the highlights from this conversation
We will be reaching out to you again. Please reach out to us. If you are one of the note takers at your table, I'd be happy to collect your notes. If you feel like you want to type them up for any reason, there's no need to do that. But if you feel like you need to do that and you want my card, I'm happy to give you my card so that you can get those to us. Again, we'll be using those notes to inform our work going forward, in which we would very happily continue to involve you. Thank you very much.
Okay, so once again, I'd like to thank you all for coming out. This was our third and final consultation for now. There probably will be more later, so just kind of stay tuned. Once again, just to reiterate, by the end of the week on the FSN Network website, the presentations, the handouts, and the recorded link will all be going on, and we'll be sending up an email to let you guys all know that's happening. Soon we will have the notes on, so you'll have various ways to go back and share information with your organizations and also review what you heard here. Once again, I want to reiterate thank you to the TOPS event team. They are wonderful, you know, whether recording notes online or checking me all in. It's been great. Also, once again, Christy sorry, it's been a long day. Tabai, who's the gender specialist at TOPS, she's been very instrumental in coordinating this. So she's in Rome right now, so we don't have to feel too badly for her, even though she's up late, but thank you, Christy. And once again, to Factors, everybody, Carlisle, Nicole, Nikki, Joe, Elena, and Allison, very much like to thank you. And as always, Joan, appreciate it. So thank you very much. Enjoy the rest of your afternoon, and we look forward to working with you again. Thank you.